One only has to look for a few minutes of the 1990s to notice the huge amount of strewn about carcasses that litter the place. Those being the carcasses of various platformer mascots. Bubsy, Gex, there are a bunch that didn't take off. However, the mascot that might be the most tragic is Klonoa, who seems to be one of the more distinct and interesting mascots of his time. Despite this, I never really played Klonoa all that much. Not because I thought it looked bad or anything, I just never really had the chance. So let's fix that. There are a few console games, a few handheld games, and 2 really wacky spin-offs that I want to get into today. They all have a whole slew of things to talk about, and each one is worthy of discussion, so bear with me on this, but we'll be going over every single one today. I hope you like Klonoa. When it comes to the first Klonoa game, something that I think about a lot is just how simple everything is. It all flows together very naturally. The gameplay is simple, with there only being a few buttons, just to jump and to inflate things to grab. You can jump a second time, but only if you're holding an enemy. I appreciate this because it's kind of a realistic way to portray a double jump. Usually double jumps don't have much reason to be the way they are, as you're pushing off of nothing to gain height. Klonoa though at least pushes off an enemy, even if it's way more height than he would gain if he did that in real life. It's logical without strictly being realistic. I like it. I'm not sure I understand the Sonic comparisons. It's surprisingly common to see Klonoa compared to Sonic despite how different the two properties are to each other. Even aside from the fact that the games function completely differently on a surface level, structurally speaking, they aren't going for the same thing at all anyway. Sonic is all about speed and memorization. You go through the levels several times in almost arcade-like fashion to find the best path to the finish as fast as possible. In Klonoa, you explore the levels as thoroughly as you can to find all the secrets in them. It's not about getting to the end as fast as possible under the gun of a timer, it's just letting the level breathe. Which was a great design choice because so many of these locales are incredibly vibrant and full of life. There's a sense of wonder to the exploration here that I hadn't really experienced in something I've played for a long time. It's also whimsical. It really captures the dreamlike aesthetic, especially in some of the more abstract later areas when the story ramps up in stakes. The final level in particular looks like a nightmare and it's absolutely wonderful. It's got this sense of eerie, playful liminality the whole game, like you're in a world that shouldn't exist. It's outstanding. One thing that really stuck out to me the whole way through this game was just the characters. They aren't really anything to write home about in terms of depth, but they are incredibly pervasive. There's so many characters you just encounter throughout levels in this game, it's such a delight. Again, none of them are particularly deep, but they're all really memorable and fun to talk to. The main villains, Joker and Gaudius, are also a consistent threat throughout, which really adds to their presence. There's only one issue with the characters, and that's that I find Hupo quite annoying and Klonoa's grandpa to be really superfluous. The former is supposed to be the emotional core of the game, but he just comes off as a little annoying. And the latter is just a weak motivation for Klonoa to save the world, which is probably something he would have done already. And god, the music really accentuates the dreamlike aesthetic of the game. It's so synthy, the way the wind instruments and synths are used in this ethereal way. It doesn't feel like we're in a tangible place. Everything feels so transient. I love it. If nothing else, I think this game's soundtrack is phenomenal. The simplicity of the game does lead to some issues though. A good example of one is just boss fights in general. Platformers don't really need to have boss fights that often anyway, but they seem to persist in every game. I'm not sure why, because they consistently kinda suck. Sonic the Hedgehog comes to mind for comparison, where the bosses amount to little more than just beating them as fast as possible so you can move on. Klonoa is very similar in that regard. The bosses are incredibly simplistic and just involve you hitting them 3 times so you can move on. The only fight I found actually difficult was Joker, and that's because the depth perception was all messed up when throwing objects into the background and the foreground. Speaking of that, the levels themselves have a 2.5D spin on them. While they are rendered in a 3D space, you can only move in 2D, but you can also face forward and backward. This is used to throw things into the background and foreground or pull things out of them. Conceptually, it's really cool. There's a lot to discover in these imagined worlds, and going for saving all the prisoners in each level really puts your puzzle skills to the test. However, I don't think that they end up doing a lot with it. Sure, it's neat the first few times it's used, but eventually it just becomes the equivalent to solving a puzzle by pressing a button. It's not terrible, but as a system to frame a game around, it is a bit lacking. Luckily, the game is quite short, so it never really drags that much. The game ends in a pretty interesting way, and it's probably what most people who finish this game think of when they discuss it. Essentially, Klonoa gets told by Hupo that he was never really supposed to exist in that world despite having memories of living a life there. It really got me, and I think it works. He's a dream traveler who goes from world to world to solve problems. Even though I wasn't really attached much in Klonoa's world due to its inherent and effectively charming abstractness, I was grounded in Klonoa's and Hupo's relationship. So for the two of them to be forcibly split up at the end because Klonoa is a dream traveler, I really like it, even despite my annoyances with Hupo. With that being said, I don't think the game was very effective at exploring this admittedly very interesting idea. It just shows up at the end, the idea that our experiences, while temporary, are inherently valuable, but it's just not something the game has a lot of time to sit on. Door to Phantomile is an interesting game. I can't say I see where all the praise comes from, but I do think it's fun enough. It's a cute, whimsical adventure through a dreamscape, and it's not trying to be much more than that. I appreciate the philosophical ideas it tugs at, but I wish the game went further with it. It's fun for what it is. Lunatea's Veil takes a much more interesting direction. There's a lot to love about it, in comparison to the first game especially, and I think the two works are incomplete without the other one. It's sort of a natural next step for Klonoa himself, a maturation of the philosophical ideas presented in the first game. It makes the duology a classic coming of age for the character. But before I talk about the game, I have to tell you that I can't really comment on the soundtrack of this game because my emulator, my real PlayStation 2 sound was broken. If I had the music on, it would just screech, so sorry to say that I can't talk about what was one of my favorite parts of the original game. Anyway, to continue on my thought from before, Klonoa 2 is just an edgier game all around. Though I wouldn't necessarily say the stakes are higher, both games have a world and plot involved, they are more emphasized. The colors are much less saccharine in general. Even a carnival level is set in the dead of night, so it isn't too bright. It's a very dismal looking game, which perfectly fits with the ideas that they were grappling with this time. It's a depressing look. Speaking of depressing, Leorina is a surprisingly present and established antagonist, especially when compared to this game's previous offerings. Joker is a wild card, a largely whimsical character befitting the tone of his game. To be complicated would distract from what he is, a clown. Leorina, on the other hand, is deadly and complex. She's still not incredibly deep or anything, but her struggles with becoming a priestess leading to her becoming a sky pirate are compelling enough. I love her design, and I love her weird cat minion too. She's cool, and weirdly menacing sometimes. I will say that I don't appreciate how she's handled at the end of the game. You gotta fight her, but then she just transforms into a big monster guy. I don't know, I know this is rather pedantic, but I would have loved to fight her before she turned into a big monster guy. It would feel a lot more personal and cathartic to have an actual fight with her. It's not a huge deal though, it's still effective. On the subject of the priestesses, one of them accompanies you for the entire game, acting the same way Hupo did in terms of powering Klonoa's air bullets. Her name is Lolo, and she's adorable. She's the emotional core of this game, and watching her become a full priestess is just so heartwarming. It's a perfect counterbalance to how grim and discordant everything feels, to have such a straightforwardly kind character. That being said, the game being framed around a quest to get her some special elements doesn't really sit right with me. I kind of like the short and sweet freeform nature of the first game, a journey from place to place to save the world. Now it's sort of an epic RPG quest to get all the things, and I've never been huge on those. It is an excuse to see some interesting places all over this particular dream, which is a different dream to the last game, but overall it's structured that's always felt really artificial to me. Speaking of set pieces, they added something really cool in this one. Snowboarding segments. Much like everything else in Klonoa, they're mechanically basic. All you can really do is jump and grab things, but this time you can't really control your movement, but they're visual delight. There is one in particular where you loop around that I actually had to think about, which was appreciated, but for the most part they're just nice to look at. That's all they really have to be. I guess this might be where the Sonic comparison comes from. A lot of the reason they look so good is due to the much more well-realized settings in this game. The first Klonoa game focused a lot on how abstract the world of dreams was, which was very effective for that specific game. This game's more grounded style also brings with it a more grounded idea of what the world is like, and I appreciate that in some regards. The carnival, for instance, is a kind of place that might exist. The stormy sea feels like an actual ocean, and the tower there being a lighthouse just fits. Ascending a statue to get to a priestess's temple, it all feels so cohesive, like a different kind of dream. One area in particular embodies all of this very well: the Maze of Mirrors. This is one of my favorite levels in any platformer. It's all so quiet. It's aesthetically perfect, and it ties so well into the overarching narrative. The people here hide from their emotions and their own memories. Klonoa's own reflection follows you along the rooms, forcing you to reflect on everything that's led up to this point. It's a bit confusing to navigate compared to many other levels in the game, but that's why it works so well. It's powerful on its own, and it sounds like a high-concept short story. I love it to pieces. A fantastic idea for a level. Sometimes this game feels like a nightmare, as in addition to the gloomy atmosphere, there's an additional character tagging along with Klonoa and Lolo that I don't quite understand. This guy's named Popka, and I couldn't really find a good place in the video to talk about him. I just don't think he adds anything. I think he's supposed to be funny. All he does is say rude things to people. I ignored him, and you probably should too. Mechanically speaking, Klonoa 2 is a pretty weird game. It doesn't really change much from the first one, and doesn't even introduce that many new challenges. I can't say that it's bad per se. I mean, I liked it well enough in the first game. It's just not much improved here. Boss fights are about as bad too. I thought I'd note this even though it doesn't matter much, but the game gives you extra lives for free for some reason. Like when you die enough times, it just starts giving you extra lives. I'm not sure what the point of lives is in the first place if you can't ever run out of them, but I guess the developers just really wanted to make sure nobody got stuck. Lives are largely vestigial mechanics, but I think it would be better to just remove them entirely. The ending of this one is also a twist, though it's much less initially powerful. However, I think that has lots more to say despite lacking some of the punch of the original game. The final boss essentially wants to drape the entire world in sadness. To get rid of Lunatea's veil, as he says, the one that shields it from depression. And while it isn't explicitly underscored, we see that all throughout the game, Lunatea's veil. We see people turn to religious conviction, hedonistic carnivals, war-torn campaigns of terror, and their own memories of happiness just to escape the prospect of ever being sad. And when Klonoa finally leaves Lolo to move on to the next dream to save, and she cries, it's sad. But she moves on. It's the only way to heal, after all. Lunatea's Veil is probably the most meaningful of any of the Klonoa games to me. It's definitely my favorite of them. It's a story about the nature of sadness and its effect on people. The marriage of level design and thematic relevance is pretty impressive. I think it's even a fine note to end on, but I also think that it leaves things pretty open for more adventures. But while Klonoa's time on main consoles would end here, the series really was just beginning. There's so much more to cover. Klonoa for WonderSwan is a very weird place to take the Klonoa series. I kinda like it in a lot of ways. Aesthetically speaking, the weirdness leans into the inherent limitations of the WonderSwan itself. Better to play to strangeness than vibrancy on a console that can't portray more than 2 colors. The fact that the whole game is presented as museum drip is also adorable. You go in and out of paintings and different works of art to access the worlds, and your saves are represented as tickets to the museum. This is no Super Mario 64 in terms of entering and exiting paintings. It's more akin to something like Super Mario World, which is something that I take a lot of umbrage with. In the console Klonoa titles, unique levels were incredibly abundant, but here they've been exchanged for world themes. It's not ideal and removes a lot of the charm and mystique from the original games. It certainly doesn't handle surrealism as well as the first Klonoa. Also, God, the music is atrocious. The WonderSwan sound chip was not made for this. It hurts so much on your ears. I had to turn the sound off halfway through my playthrough because it felt like someone was scraping against my eardrums. The sound effects were equally awful. Now, there's a lot to unpack here as the first Klonoa title on the handheld in terms of how it does characters. By that I mean one specific character. Hupo's back. There's no explanation for why he's here or what's even going on. He's just here. After such a heartfelt ending to the first Klonoa game that focused on the value of their ephemeral friendship, the game just says, actually no, he's just here again. Breathtakingly stupid choice. It's utterly baffling. Luckily, the game's other characters have made it out unscathed. You meet a lot of new faces that create art for the museum, but my personal favorite being the first one you meet, a guy named Piku. They all have different hang-ups about their art, and it's the part of the game that felt the most like the console Klonoa titles. The writing is as whimsical as it ever is, even if it's not particularly layered. The gameplay itself is pretty on par for Klonoa, though with the noticeable lack of 2.5D for obvious reasons. The game is now strictly 2D, which removes a lot of the identity of the Klonoa series, but there's not really anything else they could have done here. However, the real killing blow is that the controls feel way less responsive and then the camera pans so awkwardly. It's a game that's rather hard to navigate around in. In order to ensure people play through the entire level, I suppose, the games are now based around a collectathon gimmick. Collect all the things in every level to progress to the next one. In concept, this isn't a terrible idea. It inspires you to explore the beautiful locales often present in Klonoa games. However, that doesn't really shake out in this game, considering that the locales are significantly pared down. Couple that with a lot of the puzzles being incredibly obtuse, and it's not a fun time. One interesting new shake-up to the formula introduced to this game are vertical levels you have to tilt to your actual WonderSwan console for. While they're not amazing or anything, I definitely appreciate that they changed up the way you interface with the game, mainly because the core gameplay of this game is so repetitive. It's also neat to have to actively shift your hardware. It feels like you and the game are having a little bit of fun with each other. However, the biggest change of the game that I can praise it for is the fact that boss fights were removed entirely. It's nice that such a vestigial aspect of platformer game design was just removed here. That being said, there's not much else to say about Klonoa and the Moonlit Museum. It's an interesting take on Klonoa in a handheld form, and eerie in a lot of ways. The museum at night is a very striking setting. It doesn't leave you with much though. Unlike the last two Klonoa games, which had stingers for endings, this game doesn't even do that much. It's just okay. The biggest takeaway is that it's meditating on the nature of art in relation to its artist, but it doesn't focus enough on the art created by the various artists you meet for that to really mean anything. And I don't think I have to tell you that the WonderSwan isn't exactly an ideal console for that kind of meditation. Empire of Dreams takes what was an okay formula from the WonderSwan game and expands upon it to make it actively worse. For starters, it botches the most important part of a Klonoa game. The presentation is strictly awful. There's no getting around it. It's so bare bones, it feels even closer to a 2D Mario game than ever before. Moonlit Museum used its limited scope to create a distinct tone. This game doesn't care. Also has a lot of things that feel explicitly like they only exist to show off how the GBA can dilate and rotate and interpolate sprites. I'm sorry, but that just always looks bad. Not a whole lot to talk about here in terms of plot either. The Emperor is just a bad guy who wants to outlaw falling asleep for some reason. It doesn't make any sense, and the characters you meet along the way all suck. It's really just a baffling game. Hupo is back again too for no discernible reason. From a gameplay perspective, it's more of Moonlit Museum, though notably without the vertical levels. There are a lot of changes though that are very odd. You could customize your controls in a 2001 Game Boy Advance game as an example. While I appreciate the option, there are only two control schemes and neither is really that much better than the other. You also now have the ability to face forward and backward again, toward the screen and away from it, like in the console titles. However, in this game you can't do anything with that. It's just there because it was in the console titles, I guess. Puzzles are now made a lot more streamlined simply because when you get soft locked, you can now reset the screen in order to try again. They're still annoying, and a lot of them are pretty esoteric, especially in the final world, but they're made so much more tolerable just by this one change. It's practically necessary considering they have such a limited view ahead of you that you get blindsided by puzzles often. Also, the water puzzles are so easy to skip just by damage boosting over them, it's really funny. In place of vertical levels, there are now auto-scrollers and snowboarding levels. The snowboarding levels are weird endless runner type things, but to have them at all kind of misses the point of the snowboard in Klonoa 2. In Klonoa 2, the very nature of the snowboard was mostly as a visual spectacle, to show off the cool areas from that game in a completely different context. Here, it doesn't make much sense at all considering how bland everything looks. The auto-scrolling levels, while mechanically novel for Klonoa, don't gel with his moveset very well. His moveset is incredibly slow and it doesn't help that his inputs are still pretty delayed from the WonderSwan game. The difference is that that game has no levels that require you to input things very quickly. Luckily, the auto-scrollers are over rather quickly in most cases. However, there's one other thing that involves quick inputs that sucks. Boss fights. These are just absolutely awful. The ones in the mainline Klonoa games for console were bad, but bearable, but these ones give you a headache. They're formulaic yet incredibly cheap. Their attacks hit a very wide portion of the screen. Most of them are manageable though. The final boss, however, is not. First off, you have to fight the penultimate boss, who has a ton of bullshit moves that are tied to RNG. Then you have to fight the final boss immediately afterward, and if you game over, you have to go all the way back to the beginning of the penultimate boss. It's really annoying, and there's no catharsis because nothing in this game matters or makes sense. The ending is the Emperor waking up and deciding that the entire game was a dream and becoming a better ruler. This doesn't work for a lot of reasons, but we don't really give a shit about this guy. There's no reason to like him, or really anyone in this game. It barely even felt like a Klonoa game. Just a game that had the aesthetics of Klonoa, but with nothing passionate about it. It's definitely my least favorite one, just because it has the least amount to say. Even Moonlit Museum had an underlying message about the various kinds of artists it takes to make excellent works of art. Empire of Dreams says nothing. Dream Champ Tournament, the finale in the 2D handheld Klonoa trilogy, I can't believe I said that, is a market improvement in a lot of ways. The presentation is certainly better with a lot more imaginative locations than the first game had. There's a train level for instance, and the enemies even wear little conductor hats. It's so cute. The water level is an actual ocean, you have to traverse it using a submarine type thing. It's still not amazing, especially considering it's on the same framework as the first Klonoa Advance game, but it's a start. The game is framed around a tournament arc as the title implies. There's a lot to love here. I mean, the first few tales were just of the epic quest variety, so a tournament storyline is pretty fresh for the series. It also has a very artificial vibe to all the locations, like the knowledge that the tournament changes the nature of the aforementioned ocean area and stuff. It's a pretty neat concept, and as you get further in the tournament, you learn more and more about the true nature of it. I like it. What I don't like is how the tournament is mainly made up of returning characters from previous games. I mean, they brought back Popko, which is already a major strike against this game. Lolo returns too, which is similar to how I feel about Hupo's return in the past two games. Speaking of that teal bastard, where is Hupo? He just disappeared again. What an odd choice. Our villain of the hour is Garland, the guy who runs the tournament. I mean, it's technically a twist, but he's so obviously intended to be the villain from the get-go that it would be hard for me to say that he wasn't intentionally portrayed that way. He's a cyborg dog guy thing, and he has ulterior motives for this tournament, like turning people into gears to power his mechanical empire. I mean, it's kind of a metaphor for the way corporations exploit their workers, but it's also resolved incredibly easily by the police of all things at the end, which prop up those same corporations. It's incredibly vapid. I do like the rivalry Klonoa builds up with this new character, Gantz, throughout the game. Gantz is a literal lone wolf type character who wields a gun. He's essentially Klonoa's very own Shadow the Hedgehog, just with less nuance. And that's certainly fine by me. He doesn't do a whole lot in the actual plot though, aside from giving Klonoa trouble, but he's fun enough. Something else that adds more character to this game is that they changed the hint signs, which have been in every game up to this point, into little robots that were created by Garland to help you with the tournament. Honestly, it's cute. That being said, it's probably the only thing changed from the original GBA Klonoa game, which sucks because that's a game that could have used a lot of fine-tuning. Oh wait, I forgot they added a superfluous ranking system because apparently Shadow the Hedgehog wasn't the only thing they wanted to ape from Sonic Adventure 2. Out of all the games, I would say this is Klonoa at its most Sonic-esque. There's a Shadow XP, a ranking system, and it even has overt anti-industry messaging going on with Garland and the Gears. From some research, I found that Garland is actually just literally based on Eggman. I would say that this is what people mean when they call Klonoa a ripoff of Sonic, but it's just too obscure of a title even with Klonoa's own canon for me to confidently say that. I don't know. Oh, and snowboarding is back again. This time, the snowboarding levels are from behind Klonoa. That's it. That's the biggest difference. It's hard to judge depth on a Game Boy Advance, and they just look really bad. The snowboarding levels are based around Spectacle, sure, and this is probably the closest to Spectacle a GBA can handle. That being said, I don't think that they should really even be here. They're an eyesore. Boss battles have been interestingly repurposed in a way that I prefer. Instead of just being fights to the death that don't really have much going on platforming-wise, they're instead races across platforming challenges. As opposed to a lot of platform boss fights, this is actually a challenge of your skills. Until you just have to literally fight a giant seahorse monster in one of the races, but hey, old habits die hard. The final boss in particular is just really bad. It's a showdown with Garland and his ugly, dilated, and interpolated GBA mecha, which has very limited windows where you can attack him, and in the second phase you have to constantly be grappling onto something or else you will fall to your death. It's stupid. But hey, not as bad as the RNG Fest that was the first Klonoa GBA game's final boss, so that's worth something I suppose. Klonoa 2 Dream Champ Tournament is a very mixed bag for me. While it's not as bad as Empire of Dreams, and actually attempted to say something about exploitation, I can't say that it hit many marks at all. The nature of the exploitation is undercut by a lot of factors, like the fact that they're literally being turned into cartoon gears, or that's all the fault of one person instead of systems of abuse. As a critique of capitalism specifically, it also fails because it's the most thinly veiled and corporate the series gets as a game. The characters present here are an endless cavalcade of callbacks to the more profitable adventures in the hopes of reclaiming that revenue. It's painfully average and insultingly basic in its messaging. Now that we have the two 2D platforms out of the way as opposed to the 2.5D ones, there are a couple more oddballs I have to talk about. First off is Klonoa Heroes, Journey of the Star Medal, which is probably the game I was most interested in playing. It's an RPG and I love those despite their flaws. It even has an anime opening theme song, which is hilarious to me in all its GBA Bit Crush glory. Then you notice that it has a bunch of reused characters again, except everything is recontextualized this time. It's basically an entirely different game now. This in some ways is genius. I love when narratives are played with in this way. However, it has to be with purpose or else it just feels needless. Here it just feels haphazard, and since the game doesn't really comment on this or use it for anything, it feels like another step in undercutting the ephemeral intent of Klonoa's original adventures. The fact that they keep reappearing just to fill out the cast of Klonoa titles is shockingly tone deaf to those original endings, those original narratives. Klonoa's time with everyone is temporary, but it still matters? Nope, they're going to come back constantly. Also, so much of the game is in this visual novelty storytelling style with tons and tons of expository banter. So much of the dialogue doesn't tell us much of anything other than something is happening, I suppose. The way the portraits are manipulated during scenes is cute, but the whole game really just feels like a framing device for the field missions, even the towns where you seek out more dialogue. And those field missions are probably the worst core gameplay in the Klonoa series. The combat in this game is an odd top-down action RPG. Klonoa has two attacks, one red and one blue. There really is no reason for these attacks to be differentiated, they're just an arbitrary way of choosing which one to do more damage to enemies with. Seriously, I'm really not sure what the point of this is. It'd be like if Pokemon had multiple types, but you could switch between them whenever you wanted at any given point in the middle of combat, and all of them did the same amount of damage aside from type advantage. It's so superfluous. Something also quite annoying about this game is that you can't change your equipment on the fly like many other RPGs allow you to do. You can only open your menu after completing an area. While I do think dedicating to a loadout can be important, sometimes you get something new that you really want to try out while you're on a screen, and also when you level up you get points to spend on your stats that you can't use until the end either. It's just incredibly frustrating, especially since none of your stats really seem to matter much anyway. This level of customization betrays the nature of Klonoa games as intentionally simple. While there aren't a huge slew of options, the fact that there are many as there are anyway means players have way more choice than a Klonoa game would normally allow, especially when so many of the options don't really have much intrinsic meaning. Speed, for example, doesn't make any sense. It increases your critical hit rate. You don't actually move faster after improving it. It doesn't help that later you get access to more playable characters with their own stats and equipment to worry about. It just doesn't feel very Klonoa at all, and doesn't use those changes to meaningfully say anything about Klonoa. It's also just so weird to see Klonoa using a sword. Like, he just has a sword in this game. It's not his only weapon option, thank god, but there's this weird sword that has a ton of forward momentum every time you finish a combo using it. I have no idea what was going on with that. Did they think that he needed a sword because it's an RPG? I'm sure I still could have enjoyed the game had the game not been so repetitive. Apparently becoming a hero solely involves killing monsters, traveling to another area, killing monsters, and then traveling to the next area to do more of the same. There's not a lot of distinct reason for why you're doing what you're doing, it's just a lot of killing. Not a gameplay loop that really works for me, especially with a game as long as this one. At the very least, boss fights make more mechanical sense in this game just due to the fact that fighting enemies is the name of the game here. They're still really boring and kind of awful, but that's more due to the nature of the game itself. The weird out of place stuff here more has to do with the fact that there are several stealth levels. However, due to the small size of the screen, you can't meaningfully interact with the puzzles until after you've failed them several times, which is kind of disheartening. You have to die several times in order to get past one screen of these guys. Ugh. It's really hard to find any merit to the Klonoa RPG underneath all the crust of repetitive RPG gameplay and a weak narrative about characters who aren't even the same ones we care about fundamentally. I suppose it's supposed to be a game about how heroism is actually about teamwork, considering it's the only one where multiple people are playable throughout the adventure, but I don't know. I would have been sold on that more had there actually been camaraderie between the main characters. It's the classic pitfall of an RPG. Too long with not a whole lot to say. There's one last foray into Klonoa spin-offs I'd like to talk about. It's Klonoa Beach Volleyball. Yes, I'm really not sure what else to tell you about it. It's Klonoa Beach Volleyball. It's a volleyball game, but you play as Klonoa characters. In some respects, this insanity is welcomed, but I can't help but feel like it's super cheap to bring back even more characters this time for no discernible reason. I also think it's kind of funny that Garland is the antagonist here again. Like, yeah, that guy was such a popular character, I guess. I'm not sure how else to elaborate on the gameplay other than by saying it's beach volleyball. It's about as fun as beach volleyball, which isn't particularly fun at all. What do you expect? It's imprecise and not very fun to control, and that's just how volleyball is sometimes. It doesn't do much of anything, it's just beach volleyball. Klonoa is a series that often gets a lot of credit for being deeper than its contemporaries. On some level, this is true. Klonoa does target deeper ideas than something like Mario or Crash Bandicoot. However, Klonoa also truly fails to really make those ideas mean anything. The aesthetics of the two console platformers are incredible, and they easily have the most to say, but they come short of anything super impactful. Klonoa 2 is a wonderful game, though. However, everything else in the series just doesn't feel right. It's all a massive blur of things, and endless amounts of recycling the same ideas and characters. I don't know what killed Klonoa, but the oversaturation of the games probably helped his death along in some way. For all their flaws, the console games are what they need to be. cute, and a bit existentially intimidating. With 2 new remakes on the horizon, Klonoa may be making a triumphant return to video games. I wouldn't bet on it, especially considering that the last time they tried this it didn't happen. I just don't think there are enough Klonoa fans out there for him to keep making new games. But who knows, maybe I could be wrong. And I wouldn't mind returning to the worlds and ideas of Klonoa, and seeing where the series takes its ideas next. This has been Arcade Everlasting, wahooing along, signing off. Thank you for watching.